No army, no oil, no water. This country had nothing, and today it's richer than Japan. In 1965, this country had no army, no oil, no farmland, not even enough drinking water to survive on its own. Today, it has one of the highest incomes per person on the planet, a currency stronger than the British pound, and a government with so much cash sitting in reserve that economists struggle to count it all. This is the story of the country that looked poverty in the face and simply decided it wasn't allowed to exist anymore. This is the story of Singapore. To understand how strange this transformation really is, picture this. A tiny island, smaller than New York City, gets kicked out of a political union it just joined. It has no natural resources. Its neighbors are bigger, richer in raw materials, and not exactly friendly. Most economists at the time looked at this little island and predicted exactly one outcome: failure. Some experts genuinely believed Singapore would not survive as an independent nation for more than a few years. So how did this so-called doomed island become one of the richest places on Earth, richer per person than the United States, richer than Germany, richer than Japan? The answer is not luck. It's not geography. It's not even trade, although trade played a role. The real answer is something most countries are too afraid, too disorganized, or too political to ever attempt. Let's rewind to 1965. Singapore had just been separated from Malaysia after a short and uneasy merger. Picture crowded wooden shophouses stacked on top of each other in the city center. Picture entire neighborhoods without running water, without sewage systems, without electricity. In some areas, livestock wandered freely between people's homes. In 1961, a single fire in one of these slum neighborhoods burned down nearly 3,000 homes in a single afternoon, leaving 16,000 people homeless overnight. This wasn't a poor corner of the country. This was much of the country. Unemployment was high. Ethnic tensions between Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities simmered just beneath the surface. And the new government had almost no money in the bank. This is where most nations would have spent decades drowning in committees, blaming colonial history, or waiting for foreign aid to arrive. Singapore's leadership did something different. They treated poverty the way a surgeon treats a tumor. Not as a tragic inevitability to manage gently over generations, but as a problem to be removed, quickly, methodically, and without much patience for objections. The first move was housing. In 1960, just before independence, the government had already created an agency called the Housing and Development Board. Its mission was almost absurdly ambitious: build housing for almost the entire population, fast. Within its first 5 years, that agency built more than 50,000 apartments. To put that in perspective, that's more than double what the previous Colonial Housing Authority had managed to build in over 3 decades of trying. By the end of the 1960s, more than a third of all Singaporeans were living in government-built apartments. By the 1980s, that number had climbed past 80%. But here's the twist that makes this more than just a story about construction speed. The government didn't just build apartments and rent them out. They wanted citizens to own them. Lee Kuan Yew, the country's first prime minister, believed that a nation full of renters has no reason to care if the country succeeds or fails. But a nation full of owners has skin in the game. If the country prospers, their home becomes more valuable. If the country collapses, they lose everything. Suddenly, every citizen had a personal financial stake in national success. It's one of the simplest psychological tricks in the history of nation building, and it worked almost perfectly. There was a deeper reason behind this obsession with ownership, and it has to do with something most outsiders forget about Singapore. It was never really one nation to begin with. The population was a patchwork of Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities, many of them recent immigrants with no shared history, no shared language, and very little reason to feel loyal to a flag that had only existed for a few years. Lee Kuan Yew understood that you cannot ask people to feel like citizens of a country if they don't feel like they actually belong anywhere in it. Owning a home was never just about shelter. It was the fastest way to manufacture a sense of belonging in a society that had none. A man who owns his apartment has a reason to vote for stability instead of chaos. A mother who owns her apartment has a reason to want her neighborhood to thrive instead of decay. The government wasn't just solving a housing shortage, it was engineering loyalty, block by block, family by family. Of course, owning a home requires money, and most Singaporeans in the 1960s didn't have much of it. So, the government built a second mechanism to solve that problem: forced saving. Every worker in Singapore was required to set aside a percentage of their paycheck into something called the Central Provident Fund. Their employer added a matching contribution on top. This money wasn't optional pocket change. It built up, year after year, into a serious sum. And crucially, the government allowed citizens to use this fund to pay for their government-built apartments. In effect, ordinary factory workers and shopkeepers, people who would never have qualified for a traditional mortgage anywhere else in the world at the time, were quietly building real estate wealth through a savings account they barely had to think about. Picture two workers in two different countries, earning the exact same modest wage. One lives somewhere with no forced savings system. He spends what he earns, maybe saves a little, and 20 years later still has very little to his name. The other lives in Singapore. He never sees a large chunk of his salary. It disappears straight into his retirement and housing fund. He barely notices it missing from his paycheck. But 20 years later, that invisible deduction has turned into an apartment he owns outright and a retirement account most of the world's working class could only dream of. Multiply that by an entire population, and you start to see how a nation with zero natural wealth quietly built an asset-owning society from nothing. There's a piece of this puzzle that almost never makes it into the simplified version of the story, and it's arguably the most ruthless part of the entire plan. None of the housing boom could have happened if the government didn't also control the land underneath it. In the 1960s, Singapore passed laws giving the state sweeping power to acquire private land for public development, and it capped how much it would pay for that land at values from before development even began. In plain terms, if you owned a plot of land and the government decided it was needed for a housing project, you got paid based on what the land was worth before anyone built anything valuable nearby, not after. Landowners couldn't sit back and get rich just by holding property while the city grew around them. By the mid-1980s, the state directly controlled more than 3/4 of all the land in the country, up from less than a third just a few decades earlier. This sounds harsh, and in many democracies, it would be politically impossible. But it meant the government could build housing at a scale and price that private developers never could have matched, because the most expensive ingredient, the land itself, had been taken almost entirely out of the speculative market. Housing solved stability. But stability alone doesn't create wealth. For that, Singapore needed something to actually sell to the world. And this is where the second pillar of the strategy comes in, turning the entire country into bait for global business. In 1961, the government created the Economic Development Board. Its job was simple to describe and brutally hard to execute: convince the biggest companies on earth to set up factories and operations in Singapore. The pitch wasn't about culture or charm, it was about reliability. Tax breaks, yes. Modern infrastructure, yes. But most importantly, a government that did not change its mind every election cycle, that did not tolerate bribery, and that actually delivered on what it promised. In a region where corruption and political instability scared off foreign investors, Singapore quietly built a reputation as the one place where a contract actually meant something. This required an uncomfortable level of internal discipline. Lee Kuan Yew didn't just talk about ending corruption, he went after it directly, even when it meant investigating people close to his own government. He famously told critics that if you want to clean up corruption, you start by being willing to jail your own friends. That single idea, that the rules apply to everyone, including the people in charge, became the foundation that convinced multinational corporations they could trust Singapore with serious money. It worked. Companies from the United States, Japan, and Europe began pouring investment into the tiny island. Factories went up, ports expanded. Singapore leveraged its old position as a British trading hub and turned it into one of the busiest shipping and logistics centers on the planet. Jobs appeared by the thousands, then by the hundreds of thousands. The economy that had nothing to export in 1965 was, within a couple of decades, exporting electronics, refined oil, and financial services to the entire world. Think about what this actually required psychologically from a young government. Most newly independent nations in the 1960s were deeply suspicious of foreign corporations, viewing them as a leftover symbol of colonial exploitation. The popular move, the move that would have won cheers at the time, was to nationalize industries, kick out foreign businesses. Singapore did almost the opposite. It welcomed the very multinational corporations that other newly independent nations were busy rejecting, and it built an entire government agency whose only job was to make those companies feel welcome. That decision looked, to plenty of observers at the time, like selling out. In hindsight, it looks like the single most important economic bet the country ever made. Here's the part that surprises most people. None of this happened through some secret formula nobody else could copy. Housing, savings, foreign investment, low corruption, none of these ideas are exotic. Plenty of countries have tried versions of each one individually. The real secret wasn't any single policy. It was the refusal to treat poverty reduction as a slow, gradual, someday kind of project. Singapore's government moved with a kind of urgency you almost never see in modern governance, building tens of thousands of homes in just a few years, designing financial systems specifically to force long-term saving habits onto a population that desperately needed them, and holding officials to standards usually reserved for the private sector. It was less inspiration and more execution, applied at a speed and consistency that almost no other nation has matched. There is, of course, a darker side to this story that deserves honesty rather than glossing over. This speed and consistency came at a cost. Political dissent was suppressed. Opposition candidates faced serious legal and political obstacles. Press freedom was tightly controlled. Critics argue that Singapore's economic miracle was only possible because its government had a level of control over its population that most democracies would never accept. Whether that trade-off was worth it is something economists, historians, and Singaporeans themselves still argue about today. But the economic results are simply not in dispute. Singapore's income per person rose from around $500 in 1965 to many tens of thousands of dollars within a few decades, an increase so large it's almost difficult to comprehend. A country once written off as too small, too poor, and too vulnerable to survive on its own, became one of the wealthiest nations on the planet, with foreign reserves so large they rank among the biggest in the world relative to population size. So, the next time someone tells you that poverty is simply too big a problem to solve, remember the swamp with no resources, no army, and no allies that decided otherwise. Singapore didn't get rich by accident. It got rich by refusing to wait.